In less than 9 months, Hitler subjugated Europe. Poland fell in 6 weeks, France in another 6. Entire countries were swept away without time to react, without hope of resisting. The Wehrmacht did not fight like conventional armies. It combined tanks, planes, and radio communications in a synchronized attack, capable of breaking the strongest defenses at unthinkable speeds. While enemy generals planned responses, German troops were already buried hundreds of kilometers inside their territory. This unstoppable advance was more than a war. It was a calculated storm of destruction. How did a nation defeated in 1918 create such a lethal war machine? Why did the great European powers not know how to see what was coming, what failed in their plans? This is the story of the fastest and most brutal conquest in military history. The rise of the empire, Hitler's vision, and the plan of conquest. In the years that preceded the outbreak of the most devastating conflict in human history, Adolf Hitler meticulously built the foundations of a war machine that would transform the map of Europe. His preparation was not the product of sudden impulses, but the result of a calculated vision that fused ideological ambitions with a carefully orchestrated political and military strategy. The Germany that would emerge from this preparation would be radically different from the humiliated nation that had emerged from World War I. The seed of this transformation had germinated in the pages of Mein Kampf, where Hitler captured his fundamental ideas about Germany's destiny. The concept of Lebensraum, or living space, became the central axis of his expansionist vision. This was not simply a territorial ambition, but a doctrine that justified the conquest of the vast lands of Eastern Europe as an existential necessity for the German people. Hitler conceived this expansion as a natural right of the Aryan race, superior, according to his ideology, to the Slavic and Jewish peoples who inhabited those territories. The humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany in a position of strategic weakness that Hitler was determined to reverse. The military restrictions imposed by the treaty limited the German army to barely 100,000 soldiers and completely prohibited military aviation tanks and a significant navy. For Hitler, these limitations not only represented a military obstacle, but a symbol of German subordination that had to be eradicated. The rearmament process began in a stealthy but systematic manner. From his rise to power in 1933, Hitler began to dismantle Versailles restrictions with calculated audacity. The reinstatement of compulsory military service in 1935 marked the first open challenge to the established international order. This measure not only allowed the dramatic expansion of the German army, but sent a clear message about the Nazi regime's intentions. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 represented a crucial test of European determination to enforce post-war agreements. The absence of a significant military response from France and Great Britain confirmed to Hitler that the Western powers were not willing to risk a conflict to maintain the status quo. This diplomatic and psychological victory reinforced his conviction that he could continue challenging the international order without facing immediate consequences. Parallel to land rearmament, Hitler supervised the creation of the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring's leadership. This new air force not only broke Versailles prohibitions, but represented a revolution in German military doctrine. Aviation would become an essential component of the Blitzkrieg strategy, providing immediate air support to moving armored forces and establishing air superiority as a prerequisite for military success. The development of armored forces completely transformed the traditional concept of war. German generals, influenced by theorists like Heinz Guderian, conceived a new form of combat that emphasized speed, concentration of forces, and deep penetration into enemy territory. This military doctrine required not only advanced equipment, but unprecedented coordination between different branches of the armed forces. Diplomacy also played a crucial role in Hitler's preparation for war. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939, represented a masterpiece of political pragmatism. Despite the deep ideological animosity between Nazism and communism, Hitler recognized the strategic necessity of temporarily neutralizing the Soviet threat. This agreement not only guaranteed that Germany would avoid the feared war on 2 fronts, but also included the secret division of Poland, ensuring immediate territorial gains for both powers. Logistical preparation for war demonstrated the Nazi regime's organizational capacity. The German Army's Supreme Command developed detailed plans for mobilizing millions of soldiers, vehicles, and supplies across European borders. German railway networks were modernized and expanded to support massive movement of troops and equipment. German ports prepared to handle the constant flow of materials necessary to sustain a prolonged military campaign. German military intelligence established espionage networks throughout Europe, providing crucial information about neighboring countries' defenses and military preparations. This informational advantage allowed German planners to identify weaknesses in enemy defenses and design specific strategies to exploit these vulnerabilities. Internal control of the German population was equally important for the success of Hitler's plans. The Gestapo and SS created a repression apparatus that effectively silenced any opposition to the regime. Simultaneously, the Nazi propaganda machinery, directed by Joseph Goebbels, mobilized popular sentiment in favor of the party's expansionist ambitions. State-controlled media presented military preparation as a defensive response to external threats, while public events like military parades and nationalist celebrations reinforced the image of a resurgent and powerful Germany. This propaganda campaign not only guaranteed popular support for the regime's policies, but also created a climate of expectation and national pride that would facilitate mobilization for war. German economic infrastructure was gradually reorganized to support a war economy. Key industries were directed toward military production, while public works programs provided both employment and strategic benefits. Highway construction, for example, not only reduced unemployment, but also improved Germany's capacity to move troops and supplies quickly across the country. When Hitler finally ordered the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, Germany had been transformed into a formidable war machine. The meticulous preparation of previous years had created not only a powerful army, but a state completely mobilized for conflict. However, this preparation also contained the seeds of its own destruction, since Hitler's excessive ambition would eventually provoke the intervention of powers that would exceed German capacity to sustain a prolonged global war. The unstoppable thunder, Blitzkrieg, and the German war machine. The war that Hitler would unleash upon Europe would not be fought according to traditional combat rules. The Germans had learned the bitter lessons of World War I, where millions of soldiers died in static trenches to advance barely a few meters of muddy territory. The new way of making war that would emerge from German strategic laboratories would forever revolutionize the very concept of armed conflict, transforming the battlefield into a scenario of speed, coordination, and unprecedented devastation. Blitzkrieg, born as a response to the limitations of World War I static warfare, consisted of rapid concentration of forces at vulnerable strategic points. This revolutionary tactic, which emphasized speed and coordination, would be key in the invasion of Poland, France, and later on other fronts, demonstrating its effectiveness even against larger powers. Technological advances of the 30s provided the necessary tools to materialize these revolutionary ideas. Tanks had evolved from the slow and clumsy steel monsters of World War I to become fast and maneuverable machines, capable of crossing enemy territory at speeds that would have been unthinkable decades before. Fighter aircraft had reached levels of sophistication that allowed not only aerial reconnaissance, but direct support to ground forces with devastating precision. Blitzkrieg was based on concentrating forces at specific points of enemy defenses, where tank speed, Luftwaffe air support, and radio communications were used to disorganize the enemy before it could react. Panzers, the feared German tanks, constituted the backbone of this new way of making war. These armored vehicles did not operate in isolation, but as part of an integrated system that combined firepower, mobility, and communications. Panzer divisions advanced in coordinated formations, supported by motorized infantry units that moved in armored transport vehicles, ensuring that ground forces could maintain the frantic pace of advance that characterized Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe played a crucial role in this symphony of coordinated destruction. German bombers were not limited to attacking strategic objectives in the enemy rear, but provided direct air support to moving ground forces. The feared Stukas, with their characteristic whistle that sowed terror among enemy troops, executed dive attacks with precision that converted each bombing into a tactical element integrated in the general advance. Radio communications represented perhaps the most crucial innovation of the entire doctrine. While traditional armies depended on vulnerable telephone lines or slow messengers, German forces could coordinate complex movements in real time. Tank commanders could communicate directly with fighter pilots, aerial observers could direct artillery fire, and dispersed units could converge towards specific objectives with synchronization that seemed supernatural to their enemies. Speed constituted the most devastating element of Blitzkrieg. German attacks began without prior warning, often in places that the enemy considered impossible or improbable for an offensive. By the time defensive forces understood the magnitude and direction of the attack, German spearheads had already penetrated kilometers into their territory, cutting communication lines, surrounding entire units, and sowing chaos in the rear. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 showed the effectiveness of the new German military doctrine, which combined speed, concentration of forces, and tactical precision. Polish forces, organized according to traditional military doctrines, proved completely inadequate to face the speed and coordination of German divisions. Panzers cut through Polish defenses like hot knives cutting butter, while the Luftwaffe destroyed Polish aviation on the ground and bombed communication lines. In just 6 weeks, Poland had been completely conquered and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The speed of victory surprised even the Germans themselves, confirming that they had developed something fundamentally new in the art of war. International observers, accustomed to long sieges and attrition battles of previous conflicts, could barely understand how a country had been destroyed so quickly. The France campaign in 1940 elevated Blitzkrieg to levels of effectiveness that seemed to border on the impossible. The French had built the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications they considered impenetrable, designed specifically to stop a German invasion. However, German strategists simply avoided these defenses, attacking through Belgium and the Netherlands in a maneuver that took defenders completely by surprise. Panzer divisions crossed the Ardennes, a region the French considered impassable for armoured forces, and emerged in French territory with speed that completely disarticulated Allied defensive plans. In few days, German forces had surrounded the best French and British divisions, forcing them into desperate evacuation from Dunkirk beaches. By June 1940, France had capitulated, and Hitler walked triumphantly through Paris streets. The nation that had resisted 4 years of German siege in the previous war had fallen in barely 6 weeks. In just 6 weeks, Germany conquered Poland, and in short time, France collapsed under an attack that overwhelmed Allied defense capabilities, revealing European powers' vulnerability to a conflict of such speed and coordination. However, lightning war was not a magic formula for victory in all scenarios. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in 1941, they discovered that the vast expanses of Soviet territory, harsh climatic conditions, and fierce Red Army resistance presented challenges that Blitzkrieg could not easily overcome. The war they had imagined as a brief and decisive conflict transformed into an attrition nightmare that would eventually consume German resources. Blitzkrieg had changed the nature of modern warfare, demonstrating that speed, coordination, and concentration of forces could achieve decisive victories in incredibly short times. But it also revealed that even the most revolutionary military innovations had their limits when faced with the reality of a prolonged global conflict. The beginning of chaos, the invasion of Poland, and the Reich's first blow. In the first hours of dawn on September 1, 1939, the world changed forever. At 4:45 in the morning, German bombers began to discharge their deadly cargo on military and civilian targets in Polish territory, while little more than an hour later, German armoured divisions crossed the border in what would be the first massive application of Blitzkrieg. This moment marked not only the beginning of World War II, but also the materialization of expansionist ambitions that Hitler had cultivated for years in the darkness of his ideological vision. Poland had become the inevitable target of the German war machine for reasons that transcended mere strategic considerations. The country represented a fundamental geographical obstacle to plans for eastward expansion that Hitler considered essential for the future of the German people. The Lebensraum doctrine had identified the vast lands of Eastern Europe as the natural destiny of Aryan expansion, and Poland constituted the gateway to that dreamed empire. Poland's situation in the 1930s had been precarious from multiple perspectives. Surrounded by an increasingly aggressive Germany and an equally expansionist Soviet Union, the Polish nation had attempted to maintain a diplomatic balance that had become increasingly unsustainable. Poles had observed with growing alarm German annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia, understanding that their country would inevitably be the next target on the Nazi conquest list. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, had definitively sealed Poland's fate. This agreement, which surprised the world due to the apparent ideological contradiction between Nazism and communism, contained secret clauses that divided Poland between the two powers even before the invasion began. Hitler had managed to neutralize the threat of a two-front war, while Stalin had secured territorial gains without the cost of immediate conflict with Germany. The German invasion plan demonstrated the strategic evolution that the German army had experienced since World War I. Wehrmacht forces would not seek to repeat the errors of the previous conflict, where millions of soldiers had died in static trenches for minimal territorial gains. Instead, they would apply the principles of lightning war with unprecedented coordination between different military branches. Panzer divisions constituted the spearhead of the invasion, advancing at speeds that defied all traditional military expectations. These armored vehicles did not operate in isolation, but as part of an integrated system that included immediate air support, motorized infantry and radio communications that allowed real-time coordination. The Luftwaffe provided air cover and precision attacks against strategic objectives, while infantry units secured territory conquered by armored forces. The Polish response, although brave, proved inadequate to face this new way of making war. The Polish army had been organized according to military doctrines that privileged static defense and traditional formations, concepts that proved obsolete against the speed and coordination of German forces. Polish commanders found themselves fighting against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, breaking defensive lines before they could be adequately established. German air superiority was established in the first hours of conflict. The Luftwaffe not only attacked military targets, but also bombed civilian infrastructure, railway stations and communication centers, paralyzing Polish capacity to coordinate effective defense. The legendary Stukas, with their characteristic terrifying whistle, sowed panic among Polish troops while providing direct air support to moving ground forces. The Soviet invasion of September 17th added a dimension of desperation to Polish resistance. Polish forces, which had concentrated their efforts on containing German advance from the west, suddenly found themselves also attacked from the east by the Red Army. This two-front war made any hope of prolonged resistance quickly vanish, dividing Polish forces between multiple fronts while their communication and supply lines disintegrated under constant bombardment. The defense of Warsaw symbolized both Polish determination and the futility of resisting the German war machine with conventional means. The Polish capital endured a brutal siege that lasted several weeks, but constant aerial bombardment and German artillery finally forced capitulation on September 28th. The fall of Warsaw not only represented Poland's military defeat, but also the beginning of an occupation that would be characterized by systematic brutality directed especially against the Polish intelligentsia. The division of Poland between Nazi and Soviet occupiers revealed the nature of both powers' long-term plans. While Germans established the general government in the western part of the country, immediately implementing Germanization policies and racial persecution, Soviets directly annexed eastern regions, deporting thousands of Poles to Siberia and executing thousands of Polish army officers. International reaction to the invasion confirmed both Hitler's hopes and fears. Great Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, fulfilling their guarantees to Poland, but could not provide immediate military aid. The period known as the Phony War demonstrated that Western powers were not prepared to face the speed and effectiveness of German Blitzkrieg. Poland's fall in just 6 weeks not only made clear the power of the new German strategy, but served as a precursor of what was to come in Europe. Hitler had demonstrated that his expansionist ambitions were not empty threats, but concrete plans backed by revolutionary military machinery. The speed with which Poland was defeated surprised the Germans themselves, reaffirming the superiority of their lightning war tactics. Poland's fate prefigured the horrors that would characterize Nazi occupation throughout Europe. Systematic persecution of Polish intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders formed part of a deliberate plan to destroy Polish national identity and convert the territory into a German colony. This organized brutality policy would be expanded and refined in subsequently occupied territories, culminating in Holocaust atrocities. The invasion of Poland irreversibly transformed the European balance of power. Hitler had crossed the Rubicon, demonstrating he was willing to use military force to achieve his political objectives. The world had entered a new era of total conflict, where traditional diplomacy rules had been replaced by the brutal logic of conquest and racial domination. The lightning collapse, France annihilated in 6 weeks. On May 10, 1940, when the first German divisions crossed the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands, few in Europe imagined that in barely 6 weeks, France, the continent's great military power, would be signing its surrender to Hitler. The nation that had resisted for 4 years the German onslaught in World War I, that possessed one of the world's most modern and best-equipped armies, and that had built the most advanced defensive line of its era, would collapse with speed that would shock the entire world. French defensive strategy had been forged in the bloodied trenches of the Great War. French generals, marked by the devastating experience of the previous conflict, had reached the conclusion that static defense represented the key to repelling future German invasions. This conviction led them to build the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications that extended from the Swiss border to the North Sea, equipped with the most advanced military technology available at the time. The Maginot Line was not simply a physical barrier, but the materialization of a military philosophy that privileged defense over offense. Its underground bunkers, connected by tunnels, housed heavy artillery, communication systems, and supplies sufficient to resist prolonged sieges. French planners had designed this fortification as a death trap that would force Germans to bog down in an attrition war similar to that which had characterized the 1914 to 1918 conflict. However, this defensive mentality contained a fundamental flaw that German strategists were quick to identify. Excessive confidence in fixed fortifications had led the French to neglect the mobility and flexibility that characterized modern warfare. While France built impenetrable walls, Germany developed the capacity to avoid them completely. German high command, led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, had conceived a plan that exploited precisely this French defensive mentality. German strategy did not consist of frontally assaulting the Maginot Line, but of flanking it through an attack across the Ardennes, a mountainous and forested region that the French considered impracticable for massive armored operations. The German plan combined deception and audacity in proportions that defied traditional military conventions. While a considerable force would attack Belgium and the Netherlands, attracting Allied reserves northward, the bulk of panzer divisions would concentrate secretly in the Ardennes to execute the main blow. This maneuver, known as Plan Sichelschnitt or Sickle Cut, sought to divide Allied forces and create an irreparable breach in their defenses. The Luftwaffe had been meticulously prepared to provide the massive air support this operation required. German bombers would not only attack strategic objectives in the enemy rear, but would also provide direct tactical support to moving armored forces. Coordination between air and ground forces reached levels of sophistication that surpassed anything the Allies had previously experienced. When the invasion began, the speed of German advance immediately overwhelmed French response capabilities. Panzer divisions crossed the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes in just 3 days, emerging in open French territory before Allied commanders could completely understand what was happening. The breakthrough of the front at Sedan on May 13th created a 50-kilometer breach in French defenses, through which German armored forces precipitated like water through a broken dam. The French response revealed the obsolescence of their military doctrines. French commanders, accustomed to positional warfare, attempted to organize counterattacks according to procedures that required time and meticulous preparation. However, German forces moved at speed that made any coordinated response impossible. By the time French units received orders to move to new positions, German forces had already advanced kilometers beyond those objectives. General Maurice Gamelin, supreme commander of Allied forces, committed the fatal error of concentrating his best divisions in Belgium, responding exactly as the Germans had anticipated. This decision left the Ardennes sector defended by second-line units, incapable of resisting the onslaught of German elite panzer divisions. When Gamelin finally understood the magnitude of the threat, German forces had already penetrated too deeply to be stopped. German air superiority was established quickly and decisively. French aviation, although numerically considerable, could not compete with massive concentration of German planes, nor with coordination between air and ground forces that characterized Blitzkrieg. The feared Stukas sowed terror among French troops while providing precision support to moving armored columns. The fall of the Netherlands in 5 days and German penetration toward the English Channel coast created a tactical situation that the Allies had not considered possible. The best French and British divisions were trapped in a gigantic pocket, surrounded by German forces that had executed an enveloping maneuver of epic proportions. The Dunkirk evacuation, although it saved more than 300,000 Allied soldiers, represented recognition of complete strategic defeat. German troops' entry into Paris on June 14th symbolized not only France's military defeat, but also a nation's psychological collapse. The city that had resisted Prussian siege in 1870 and had served as bastion of Allied resistance in World War I fell without firing a single shot. The image of German soldiers parading under the Arc de Triomphe transmitted to the world the magnitude of French catastrophe. The French government, directed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun converted into symbol of capitulation, requested armistice on June 17th. The surrender ceremony took place in the same train car where Germany had signed its capitulation in 1918 in an act of humiliation deliberately orchestrated by Hitler to symbolically erase German defeat in the Great War. France's division between the German-occupied zone and the Vichy collaborationist regime completed the destruction of European political order. The power that had led resistance against German expansionism now became a satellite of the Third Reich, providing resources, labor, and political legitimacy to Nazi conquerors. The speed of German victory shocked not only Europe but the entire world. The United States, which had contemplated the possibility of remaining neutral in the conflict, began to reconsider its position given evidence that Great Britain might be left alone facing a Germany that virtually controlled the entire European continent. France's fall demonstrated that tactical innovation and strategic audacity could overcome apparently insurmountable advantages in terms of resources and defensive position. Blitzkrieg had proven its effectiveness not only against minor armies like the Polish, but also against one of the world's great military powers. This victory established the German army's reputation for invincibility and convinced Hitler that his ambitions for world domination were within reach. French defeat also revealed the limitations of purely defensive strategy in an era of mechanized warfare. Lessons from this campaign would profoundly influence military doctrine development during the rest of the conflict, demonstrating that mobility, concentration of forces, and coordination between different arms represented the key to success in modern warfare. The power of fear, terror, and propaganda in the Nazi machinery. The military conquest of Europe represented only the first phase of Nazi plans to establish their new continental order. Hitler had understood that dominating territories required something more than simple physical occupation. He needed to break the will of resistance of conquered populations and rebuild their societies according to Nazi ideology principles. To achieve this objective, the regime developed a sophisticated system that combined psychological manipulation with brutal repression, creating a control apparatus that penetrated all aspects of life in occupied territories. Nazi propaganda machinery, perfected in Germany, was deployed in occupied countries to monopolize media and create a narrative favorable to the regime. Controlling information through press, radio, and films, the regime shaped public perception while physical repression complemented this manipulation. Nazi propaganda strategy operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, it completely controlled communication media in occupied territories, ensuring that only information convenient to the regime reached the population. Local newspapers were closed or put under direct supervision, while radio stations transmitted only programs approved by German authorities. This information monopolization created an informational vacuum that was filled exclusively with the Nazi version of events. Nazis understood that to establish their permanent dominion, they needed to transform conquered populations' mentality, convincing them that resistance was useless and that collaboration represented the only rational alternative. To achieve this, they developed specific narratives for each occupied territory, adapting their messages to local circumstances and particular sensibilities of each population. In France, Nazi propaganda used defeat trauma to present collaboration as necessity to avoid more suffering, which contributed to some sectors' support toward the Vichy regime. However, resistance networks quickly emerged that, despite repression, sabotaged Nazi occupation and provided support to allies. The anti-Semitic dimension of Nazi propaganda constituted a central element of the entire strategy. Jews were systematically dehumanized through media campaigns that presented them as internal enemies responsible for all evils afflicting Europe. This demonization was not simply an exercise in irrational hatred, but a calculated tool to create scapegoats that would justify the regime's repressive policies and provide a common enemy that would unite populations under Nazi leadership. Physical terror complemented and reinforced psychological manipulation. The Gestapo and SS established surveillance networks in all occupied territories, creating an omnipresent climate of fear that dissuaded any manifestation of dissidence. Arbitrary arrests, public executions, and massive deportations were not simply punitive measures, but power spectacles designed to demonstrate the consequences of disobedience. Nazi repression operated according to a logic of collective terror that exceeded any consideration of individual justice. Reprisals against acts of resistance invariably included punishment of innocent people, creating collective responsibility that converted each citizen into hostage of everyone else's behavior. This tactic generated internal tensions in occupied communities where individual survival depended on controlling others' actions. The educational and cultural system became another front of Nazi psychological warfare. Schools were purged of teachers considered untrustworthy, while study programs were modified to reflect Nazi ideology. Libraries were stripped of books that contradicted the regime's worldview, and cultural institutions were reorganized to promote exclusively art and literature that served propaganda purposes. Youth organizations represented a particularly important objective for Nazis who understood that control of young generations was essential to establish their long-term dominion. Indoctrination programs designed for children and adolescents sought to create a new European generation educated according to Nazi principles, which would eventually replace traditional elites of occupied countries. Nazi social control strategy also included manipulation of local economic structures. The regime offered material benefits to those who actively collaborated, while economically punishing those who showed signs of resistance. This policy created material incentives for collaboration, especially in a context of scarcity and economic privation caused by the war itself. Collaborationist governments established in occupied territories served as crucial intermediaries in this control strategy. These local regimes provided a facade of legitimacy to Nazi policies, allowing repression to appear as decisions taken by national authorities instead of direct impositions by German occupiers. This tactic was particularly effective in dividing populations between those who accepted the new reality and those who maintained resistance impulses. Nazi psychological warfare also targeted resistance forces, attempting to fragment their networks with disinformation and constant threat of repression. Despite this, resistance remained active in many regions, sabotaging German occupation. Disinformation campaigns sought to create distrust among different resistance groups, while infiltration of provocateur agents sowed paranoia and fragmented clandestine networks. Torture and interrogation of captured resistors not only sought to obtain information, but also to break their companions' morale through example of suffering awaiting those who defied the regime. The psychological impact of these combined tactics was devastating for civilian populations. Constant uncertainty, impossibility of distinguishing truthful information from propaganda, and omnipresent fear of repression created a state of collective stress that undermined organized resistance capacity. Many people opted for isolation and passivity as survival strategies, avoiding any action that could attract authorities' attention. The effectiveness of this psychological destruction strategy manifested in the relative scarcity of massive resistance movements in most occupied territories. Although brave resistance groups existed in all conquered countries, they never managed to mobilize the majority of population, which remained largely passive or collaborationist during occupation. However, Nazi terror and propaganda strategy also contained seeds of its own self-destruction. The regime's extreme brutality eventually generated a rejection reaction that strengthened determination to resist, while inherent contradictions in Nazi propaganda were gradually exposed by war reality. The combination of terror and manipulation that had allowed initial control of Europe eventually became a source of weakness that contributed to the Third Reich's final collapse. The Unstoppable War, the battle for the Soviet Union and Nazi ambition. On June 22, 1941, when more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the dawn of a summer Sunday, Hitler finally materialized the obsession that had defined his political vision since Nazism's earliest days. Operation Barbarossa represented much more than a military campaign. It was the culmination of an ideology that had identified in the vast expanses of Eastern Europe the manifest destiny of the German people and the final scenario of the struggle for racial supremacy in Europe. Eastward expansion had been the central nucleus of Hitler's plans since he captured his ideas in Mein Kampf pages. The Lebensraum doctrine was not simply a territorial ambition, but an existential necessity that justified conquest of Soviet lands as indispensable condition for Aryan race survival. Hitler conceived Slavic peoples as racially inferior, destined to be enslaved or eliminated to make space for German colonists who would transform these lands into Aryan farms and cities. This ideological vision had been temporarily suspended when Hitler signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Stalin in August 1939. The agreement had allowed Germany to avoid the feared two-front war while conquering Poland and Western Europe, but had never represented more than a tactical pause. The secret division of Poland and Baltic states between the two powers had been simply a prelude to the final confrontation that Hitler considered inevitable. Preparation for invasion had begun seriously after France's fall, when Hitler felt secure enough in his Western European position to turn his attention eastward. Operation Barbarossa planning revealed the magnitude of German ambitions. It was the most massive military operation ever conceived, which would involve not only Red Army destruction, but also complete disintegration of the Soviet state and racial reorganization of conquered territory. The German plan divided invasion forces into 3 army groups that would attack simultaneously along a front of more than 2,000 kilometers. Army Group North would head toward Leningrad, seeking to isolate the cradle of Bolshevik revolution. Army Group Center would advance directly toward Moscow, aiming at the Soviet regime's political heart. Army Group South would conquer Ukraine and advance toward the Caucasus, securing agricultural and industrial resources that Germany needed to sustain its war effort. German confidence in success was based on the Red Army's apparent weakness, which had shown disastrous performance during the Winter War against Finland. Stalinist purges of the mid-30s had decapitated Soviet military leadership, eliminating thousands of experienced officers. German strategists estimated the campaign would be completed in few weeks before Russian winter arrived. When invasion began, initial German successes seemed to confirm these optimistic expectations. Soviet forces were taken completely by surprise, despite intelligence warnings that had reached Stalin from multiple sources. The Soviet dictator, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Great Britain remained unconquered, had ignored all signs of imminent invasion. Initial chaos allowed German panzer divisions to repeat spectacular successes of previous campaigns. Armored formations penetrated deeply into Soviet territory, surrounding and capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers in gigantic encirclement operations. In first days, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet planes, many on ground, establishing air superiority that seemed absolute. The speed of German advance was initially astonishing. Smolensk fell in July, apparently opening the road to Moscow. Kiev was surrounded in September, capturing more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers. By October 1941, German troops were at Moscow's gates, and many international observers considered Soviet Union collapse imminent. However, Soviet resistance proved fundamentally different from everything Germans had faced previously. Unlike Western armies, which had surrendered quickly when their lines were broken, Soviet forces continued fighting even when surrounded. Communist ideology and Russian patriotism combined to create determination to resist that surprised German invaders. Stalin, after initial shock, managed to mobilize Soviet Union's enormous human and industrial resources for defense. Factories were evacuated eastward, beyond the Urals, where they continued producing weapons for the Red Army. Millions of men were mobilized to replace initial losses, while arrival of Siberian divisions, trained for combat in extreme conditions, reinforced Moscow's defenses at the critical moment. The factor that finally defeated Operation Barbarossa was a combination of Soviet resistance with Russian winter arrival. German plans had assumed the campaign would end before November, so troops were not equipped to operate in Eastern Front extreme climatic conditions. Temperatures that descended below 40 degrees below zero paralyzed German equipment and caused thousands of frostbite cases among troops. Soviet counteroffensive launched in December 1941 marked German Army's first serious setback since war began. Fresh forces brought from Siberia, commanded by generals like Georgy Zhukov, forced Germans to retreat from Moscow's vicinity for first time in war. Wehrmacht's invincibility image collapsed along with hopes for quick victory in East. Failure before Moscow fundamentally transformed war character. What Hitler had conceived as lightning campaigns similar to those in Poland and France became attrition war that Germany could not afford to fight. Soviet human and material resources were vastly superior to German ones, and each month that passed without decisive victory strengthened Stalin's position while weakening Hitler's. United States' entry into war after Pearl Harbor completed conflict transformation into global struggle in which Germany faced a coalition of powers whose productive potential overwhelmingly surpassed that of Axis. Lend-Lease program began providing crucial equipment to Red Army, while opening of Second Front divided German forces between multiple theaters of operations. Battle for Soviet Union also revealed genocidal nature of Nazi plans for Eastern Europe. Instructions given to German troops included orders to treat Soviet prisoners of war as subhumans, resulting in death of millions of captured soldiers. Einsatzgruppen followed combat troops, massively executing Jews, communists, and Slavic intellectuals as part of conquered territory racial reorganization plan. Operation Barbarossa failure marked decisive turning point in World War II. Hitler had bet everything on quick victory in East that would have given him access to resources necessary to sustain prolonged war. Instead, he found himself trapped in two-front war that would gradually exhaust all German Reich resources. Eastward expansion, which had been conceived as final realization of Nazi vision for Europe, became beginning of Third Reich's end. The vast expanses of Russian territory, which Hitler had imagined as German people's garden, transformed into grave of his imperial ambitions and scenario of most costly defeat in German military history. The price of ambition, resistance, and collapse of the Nazi Empire. Nazi expansion had reached its maximum point in mid-1942, when German forces controlled territory extending from Atlantic coasts to depths of Russian steppe. However, this apparent continental supremacy concealed deep cracks that would gradually undermine foundations of empire that Hitler had built with vertiginous speed. Europe's conquest had been relatively simple. Maintaining it would become a nightmare that would consume German resources and eventually destroy the Third Reich. The very speed of German expansion had created problems that Nazi planners had not completely anticipated. Each conquered territory required occupation garrisons, civil administrators, and resources to maintain order. Supply lines extended across thousands of kilometers, vulnerable to attacks and sabotage. More fundamentally, Nazis had underestimated European people's resistance capacity, assuming that German military superiority would guarantee passive submission of conquered populations. This assumption proved profoundly erroneous. In each occupied country, resistance movements emerged that adopted different forms according to local circumstances but shared common determination to fight against German domination. Resistance included industrial sabotage, espionage networks, clandestine propaganda, and protection of those persecuted by Nazi regime. These activities created invisible war fought in shadows of occupied Europe. In France, resistance began organizing from occupation's first days, initially as individual acts of defiance that gradually evolved toward organized networks. General Charles de Gaulle's call from London on June 18, 1940, provided symbol and focus for resistance. French resistance was characterized by its political diversity. Communists, Gaullists, socialists, and patriotic conservatives found common ground in their opposition to German occupier. Activities evolved from clandestine newspaper distribution to sophisticated sabotage operations that interrupted German transport and industrial production. Escape networks helped downed Allied airmen and persecuted Jews reach neutral territory. By 1944, French resistance had developed capacity to coordinate significant military operations that complemented Allied landing in Normandy. In Poland, resistance was fierce and well-organized, with National Army fighting against Nazi brutality in context of ruthless occupation. Despite massive reprisals, Polish resistance maintained its struggle both in cities and countryside. Resistance in Soviet Union, driven by patriotism and communist ideology, became one of most active, with guerrillas constantly attacking German supply lines and providing key intelligence to Red Army. Partisan warfare in Eastern Europe was characterized by particular cruelty. Germans responded to partisan attacks with massive reprisals against civilian population, executing hostages and destroying entire villages. However, these brutal measures often strengthened determination to resist and provided new recruits for clandestine movements. In Yugoslavia, partisans led by Josip Broz Tito developed military capabilities so significant that they eventually liberated large portions of country without direct Allied help. Cost of maintaining control over these resistant territories became increasingly unsustainable for Germany.